Okay, good morning, everyone. Let me welcome all of you for this morning's very interesting panel discussion on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation. We are discussing today on a topic that's related to racism, social inequality, and human dignity. You all are aware the George Floyd case and the US protest is the trigger for this entire process, and the protests have actually spanned out across the world as well. So in that context, this panel discussion will focus on the issues of racism, inequality, and human dignity, and what are the responsibilities and what role should states and societies play in this entire process. For the panel discussion, we have two eminent panelists. We have Professor Ramu Manivannan from Madras University, who is also the professor and head of the Department of Politics and Public Administration, and also chairperson of the School of Politics and International Relations. He has been a fellow of the United Nations University at Tokyo, Japan. He's also been visiting professor at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Passau, Germany. He's been visiting professor at Department of Political Science, the University of Paris, and the Center for International Studies at National Chengchi University in Taipei, Taiwan. He's published over 7 books, including a very monumental documentation of the genocide and human rights issues in the Sri Lankan conflict. He's also very active socially and on social issues, and he's also, significant achievement is that he's founded 15 non-formal schools for marginal children in disadvantaged regions, tribal regions, in stone quarry regions, and for children of weavers. And he currently is actually managing one of the schools in one of the regions between Vellore and Tiruvannamalai, and that's where he's joining us from. He's also a very active in the cause of education, democracy, and freedom and development. And he runs a website called Freedom Ahead, and he's very active socially. And it's a pleasure to have him on the panel today.
Thank you.
The other panelist is a very eminent panelist, Professor M.A. Kalam. He is the Dean Administrator and for Dean of Administration and Regulatory Affairs in the new liberal university that's come up near Chennai in the Siri city, Kriya University. It's an excellent startup, and they've started the first batch last year. He is also Professor of Anthropology at the Kriya University, and he is a Professor of Eminence in Tezpur Central University. He's been a professor earlier in Madras University of Anthropology, and he was also on the boards of many UGC and Indian Council of Social Research and commissions on minority commissions, etc. He was a fellow, human rights fellow at the Harvard University and a Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellow at the London School of Economics for Politics and Economics. He's been a visiting professor at universities in France, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, and the Maulana Azad National Urdu University in Hyderabad. He's a very prolific writer and commentator and a very well-known anthropologist all over. So before I start with the panelists, let me just cover a few points on this topic. The George Floyd incident, quite obviously, I consider that as a very, a distinct human rights abuse as well as a murder on camera that's been filmed. And that's actually triggered a huge social movement across the US. The concept of, a man dominating another human being is something that's been there throughout human civilizations. And the source of all that is economic and political power, and to get work done for them by those who are in power. But that manifests itself into either through religious practices, the clergy dominates and creates structures and hierarchies, or the political structures create hierarchies and structures. In ancient times, slavery was known, and slavery was practiced when kingdom, emperors and kings who conquered new territories and they captured citizens who became slaves. The Romans and Greeks practiced in India as well. Uh, but I think beyond that enforcement of certain, obedience and work, I think the practice of slavery and racism that exists in modern societies was not, very much evident in my analysis. But notwithstanding that, the concept of modern slavery, I would link it to probably the colonial practices, colonialism, and the and the idea of white supremacy and the dominance of the West has all come out from imperialism and colonialism. And this process finally has led to exploitation of rest of the world by the small, minority of Western Europe and the white supremacy believers. And that we all know what that has led to. The Nazi development is the ultimate horror of that entire process. Uh, so I think, when we look at this, what about other civilizations? The caste system that is practiced in India is a form of racism, extreme racism as well, the untouchability. And how do we actually look at this? What is the role of state in society? States are formed by people, people form societies, and if societies practice and continue to believe in some of the ideas that are abhorrent in a very well-developed human society, then the governments will tend to appease the dominant, segments of society that feel power. And that's exactly what has happened in the US. So you had a civil war in the 19th century, which killed nearly 5 million people for abolition of slavery. But then you found it took another nearly, 70, 80 years for the US to get back voting rights for the black population. And then, of course, the practice of, creating dominance, labeling them as crime prone, keeping them deprived economically and socially is all practices that have been, in play for until the civil rights movement in the 60s. And even after the civil rights movement in the 60s, nothing much seems to have changed, as the George Floyd incident shows right now. We need to probably see what are the lessons for the rest of the world, considering that this has become a fuse that lit the fire on social equality, freedom, and human dignity across the world. And does that make a lot of difference for the rest of the world is something we need to actually look at. So to discuss all this, let me now start with Professor Kalam, who's an eminent anthropologist, because I think anthropology goes into much of all this in very deep way. And I think let me start with Professor Kalam to actually give his views on this issue, and then we will move on to Professor Ramamanivan. Professor Kalam, all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Air Marshal Mathisharan. And let me assure people who know me, when I had hair, that is the gray hair which is gone. You'll find out that the gray matter also has gone partly when I speak. So I'm not sure about the gray matter at all, but I didn't want to go to a barber shop. Therefore, I managed to clean up my own head. So let's see what happens next. Okay. Now, I think one of the things which Air Marshal was referring to was that while we talk about racism in the West, we also have aspects of casteism in India. Yeah, I think one of the problems which comes up with racism is that it springs from color. And when we talk about color, the normal term that's used is phenotype. The phenotype means observable constitution. Suppose you look at a person, the observable constitution of the person is the appearance, which results from the genotype and the environment of that person. And therefore you have color. For instance, if you go back to about 65, 70,000 years back, we had what is known as out of Africa. The out of Africa theory tells us that people moved from a small area in Africa, Malawi, to different parts of the world. And that's a history which we don't have to go into, but just to point out that the physical differences that we find amongst people today is because of as a result of moving to different locales at different points in time, staying in those locales for a long time, and developing different kinds of languages, cultures, customs, traditions, as well as physical features. And that's how the different physical features came up from people who travel, who migrated from a small area, Malawi Lake area, in Africa, West Africa, East Africa. From there, people moved over, and the differences that we find today amongst people in terms of height, in terms of weight, in terms of complexion, everything depends on what happened in local situations where they had moved to. So along with the physical features which changed amongst people and different things came up, you had to start with only the black kind of a community or group of people. And now we have different shades which have come up. Sometimes in quotes, you use the word black, you use the word white, you use the word brown, you also use the word yellow in the context of certain people who are there in certain other places. All these differences came up during the maximum last 70,000 years. But human beings, that is Homo sapiens sapiens, that's what's known as the anatomically modern human beings, have been existing on the face of the earth for about 250,000 or 3 lakh years. That's the history of human things. Homo sapiens about 3 lakh years, out of Africa theory is about 70,000, that push it maximum to 1 lakh. And all the differences that you find happen during that 70,000 or 50,000 years amongst people. And when we talk about the phenotype, we are basically talking about the differences in the physically observed appearances of the people. And now it has been more or less reduced to just the complexion of the person, which means in most time we talk about the whites and the non-whites. Now the genes which are transmitted from the parents, the genotype, is more or less common, about 93 to 97% amongst all human beings. But the physical differences, which may account for about 5 to 8%, are the ones which are setting apart people from one to another. And therefore, we have different ethnicities, we have different in quotes, which is a biological concept, not to be used socially, that's race. Okay, we have these differences which have come up amongst people. Now, if we are talking about the American society, because we are starting our discussion with George Floyd case, and therefore the protests and the society which is there, aspects of racism, social inequality, and human dignity, we cannot talk about American society or American sociology or American social sciences with no reference to race and slavery. The whole of American history for the last 400 years, that is starting from, say, 1619 was when the first Africans were brought to the American continent, 1619, which makes it about 401 years. The whole history of American society is something which has to be looked at from these two aspects: the aspect of slavery, which Marshall was referring to, and then the aspect of race. Now, in race, you have the whites on one side, and then irrespective of what you are, whether you are black, little black, dark black, jet black, brown, or the so-called yellow, you are non-white. So the entire society in the US or in most other places, for instance, where race is the defining factor, the whole thing is divided into black and white binary. And by black, there are different shades, and white is just one. Anybody who is white, and anybody who is non-white could be other shades. Irrespective of the other shades, they're all black. For instance, the Indians living in the United States are the others, or in England, for instance. They may say that some of them are very fair, and some of them are maybe fairer than the whites. They can make such claims, but they're still black. Okay, so you have this binary which is there, and if you are not white, then you're black. That's the kind of thing. So in race, it is the color or the phenotype that matters, and the inherent, hidden, embedded ethnicity, religion, which is there amongst those people, that behind the color, those things don't matter. irrespective of you belong to a particular religion, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Hindu, that does not matter. What matters is your color. And that's how the whole society gets divided. And the inherent embedded ethnicity, let me reiterate the fact, in terms of ethnicity, religion behind the color does not matter. Therefore, the segregation which happens or the exclusion which happens is just on the basis of one single factor, and that's color. Now, we will come to the caste situation slightly later and talk about how it operates in the Indian context and how it's different in many ways. What happens in a race situation is that if you're black 24 hours and 365 days. Whether you are in your own locality where you're born, or you're 100 miles away from your locality, or 20 miles away from your locality, or even 1,000 miles away from your locality, you are black. And therefore, you get identified just as one single category of black. And that's where the caste factor differs, and we can come to that later, that in a caste factor, for instance, if you're away from your place where you're born, or 100 kilometers or even 20 kilometers away from your village, you're anonymous. Nobody knows what your background is. And the disadvantage in race is that you cannot hide. In caste, there are chances of hiding, whereby if you're in a different place, you go from your village to a town or a city, there are chances until somebody probes and find out who you are. And Indians are very good at probing. They probe from your name, they probe from your looks, they probe from different kinds of places, they find out who your friends are and which school you went to or which college you went to. And that's a kind of a giveaway at a later time. But on face value, you are not identified. But in the case of race, there is no hiding. Wherever you go, you're marked, whether you are in the US or England or you come to India, you are black, irrespective of what you are. Therefore, this factor is something which is very crucial when we are talking about the race factor. And sometimes when we try to compare racism with casteism, casteism is slightly positive because you are not identified on your face. You're not identified on the face value or what exudes from you in terms of your phenotype. Your phenotype is there, and the phenotype of yours can hide quite a lot of things in the Indian context when we're talking about caste, whereas in the West context of race, the phenotype is a giveaway. You can't hide that. And that's a great disadvantage which happens in race. And of course, there is caste oppression, there's caste subjugation, people are lynched because of the caste or the religion they belong to in India. But there is some kind of an escape when you move away from your locality, which does not happen in race. So there's no hiding. And even in the densest of crowds, wherever you are picked up as black. And once you're black, like I said, your religion does not matter, your ethnicity does not matter. But in caste, what matters is your varna and the jati that you belong to. Therefore, there's a different kind of a situation. And the blacks in the US are seen as somebody who are poor on the one hand. And, biblically as well as in literature, when you look at different categories of people in religion or in history, people have different notions of how to categorize them. Some people talk about the poor as blessed, and they talk about the poor as some people who need to be helped. And in other contexts, poor are looked as somebody who do not have a locus standi in many places. They're looked as dirty. They're looked as less endowed intellectually also. And then they're less desirable, less capable, and they're prone to violence. And then hence they're dangerous. Now, this happens in the caste system also in India. If you belong to the lower caste, you are considered to be, and unfortunately in India, the lower classes and the lower caste are more or less synonymous. If you are lower caste, most of the time you are lower class. And if you are lower class, most of the time you are lower caste. And the same thing happens in terms of imagery, at least in the West, where if the black are seen as poor, they're seen as dirty, less endowed intellectually, and they're considered less desirable socially, and they're considered less capable and prone to violence. and therefore hence they're dangerous. Now, this kind of categorization or this kind of imagery comes up amongst people, then what happens is, as a consequence of that, the black is suspect, the black is despised, the black is excluded, segregated, discriminated, and deprived of so many different things, deprived of education, deprived of societal recognition, deprived of economy, and then discrimination against them is the one which is the guiding factor which happens. But then along with that, what happens is the stigma which goes with that, and that stigma is very strong. And this stigma is strong amongst anybody who does not belong to the top echelons or top bracket in a society. And this happens in all cultures. And anybody who has got an image of something which goes in that particular culture as the higher is the one which is taken into consideration, and the opposite of it, or the binary of it, that is white and black. For instance, white is good, white is something to be desired, white is something which is intellectually better, white is something which needs a job more than the black. Now, that's the kind of binary which happens. And hence what happens is the stigma is so strong that it does not allow people to move. And by move, I mean upward mobility. Upward mobility normally is of two kinds. One is the economic upward mobility, and the other one is as a concomitant factor. When people have upward economic mobility, they'll try to look for social mobility, upward social mobility. Now, when somebody has been deprived, somebody has been segregated and excluded, the battle becomes more stronger and more difficult for somebody to move from a lower position to a higher position, irrespective of the fact that you have upward economic mobility. And in all cases, believe me, if upward economic mobility happens for some reason, like for instance, reservation policy in India or positive discrimination, which happens in the United States, when upward economic mobility takes place, people start looking for upward social mobility as a concomitant factor. And when that does not happen, that's where the rub comes in, and people go in for resistance, and then this may turn violent. And in fact, I think Martin Luther King had said that riots happen because of deprivation. And color is such an obstacle to upward mobility. Whether you are desiring economic mobility, which does not happen very easily because the right kind of jobs, the right kind of vocations are not given to the blacks. Therefore, color is big obstacle in upward social mobility because of the fact, in spite of the fact that upward economic mobility has also taken place. Now, a simple example which comes from not just the United States or in the West, but happens in India also, is that when people have upward economic mobility, they start looking for residential mobility too. They want to move from lower class residences or lower class localities to slightly better or middle class localities. And in the US, it's been a very, very difficult kind of a thing for the blacks who have made it somehow or the other upward economic mobility to move from a lower class locality, a residential locality to upward. And then whenever there have been attempts, and in India it happens to everybody in India. You are not allowed to go into certain areas, and to go back to the traditional thing where the agrarams, which were reserved only for the upper caste and the others could not enter there, and we had cherries and we had segregated kind of residential mobilities. And even if somebody had money and economic power, and if there was a vacancy of a house or a house got vacant in an agraharam, I don't think the agraharam residents would have allowed the person to go and occupy the house by either buying or even renting. So similarly, in the US, what happens is if they cannot prevent anybody, the blacks, from coming into certain localities, what they do is there is this concept of what is known as the white flight. The whites get away from the places where they were there earlier because the blacks or the Asians or the Chinese or the others are coming into that locality, and they move to another kind of a place. If it is not possible, even after trying, to stop those people into coming into their own areas. So this is the kind of things which happen in race, and we have touched on certain things which happen in caste also tangentially. But then what happens is till the 1960s, there were no rights for the blacks in the United States. In 1964, they had the Civil Rights Act, that is about 56 years back. And the Civil Rights Act gave certain rights to the blacks. For instance, they could not get into certain places, they could not get into restaurants, they could not occupy the seat that they wanted in a bus. There were segregated areas for them. And in 1965, they got the voting rights. Now that's only about 55 years. And therefore, if you look at 400 years of black history in the United States, what they have got is only about 55 or 56 years back. And then these laws, regulations, statutes, they're there in many places. In India, we have this kind of laws and legislations for the downtrodden, the minorities, and the Dalits. But these are textual. They are in the text, in the written form. What's important if you are looking for changes is if those changes come up in context. That is, in situations where people actually live. So in context, if it happens, then you can say that, okay, changes are coming about. But then the textual thing does not guarantee. And therefore, most often we see that when there are legislations, they lie as rules or regulations in the books, in the text, does not get translated to day-to-day lives of the people where people are living. Therefore, the changes in context do not come about very easily, and that calls for societal changes. Now, how do societal changes come up? It can happen because of education. When people are, I'm not talking about literacy, I'm talking about education here. There are people whom I had colleagues at Madras University and elsewhere, for instance, who had PhDs, but they were highly literate. I found many of them not educated. But on the other hand, a peasant or a fisher person who has complete knowledge of the economy, ecology, and environment where the person lives has a better knowledge, and therefore that person is better educated. So we are talking about education here. So in terms of education, tolerance may come in and the spirit of coexistence may come in, and that's the societal change that has to happen. The legal things, legislations which are there do not bring in reforms. Reforms come in from the people, and reforms come in from people's aspects of what's going on at the ground level. And when these kind of reforms do not happen, in most places, it has happened to the blacks, it's happening to the Dalits, it's happening to the minorities in India, ghettoization takes place. Now, that's a very dangerous kind of a thing. By ghettoization, I mean people are not allowed to have certain basic kind of features, basic kinds of facilities in a mixed kind of locality, and therefore they're forced to live in isolated kind of places, like the cherries, for instance, that were ordained ritually, unfortunately, in India for the Dalits. Okay, now those kind of localities are the ghettos which come up. For instance, the slums which come up in many places. The very well-known slum in India, of course, is the Dharavi one, where we have these cases which are going on. And Pakistan currently is considered to have in Karachi the largest slum. Earlier, we used to say that Mumbai's Dharavi is the largest. The Orangi slum in Karachi, Pakistan, is considered to be the largest in the world. Now, this kind of ghettoization takes place, and that has its own disadvantages in terms of what happens to people. So, when people are in ghettos, they cannot participate in larger institutions of the society. And when people cannot participate in larger institutions of the society, like, say, banks, or protection from the police or political power, they develop local mechanisms. Now, these sometimes are known as aspects which develop in a culture of poverty. When you live in a culture of poverty, you develop a separate kind of a culture or cultural traits or cultural features to beat the system. For instance, those of you who have seen Godfather, you know what happens. Don Corleone, the person goes there, goes to the police and wants justice. The police does not deliver justice, therefore the person goes to the Don. And these are the kind of local things. And you cannot participate in the larger society in terms of your banking. For instance, if you want some loans from the bank, therefore what you do is people have local mechanisms of chit funds or something where they do that at different rates of interest. They have their own lending and borrowing kind of a system. And this happens when ghettoization takes place and a culture of poverty develops. Now, identifying and attacking these kind of localities becomes easy for people because they're clusters of poor localities, they're clusters of poor people. And riots succeed because of the fact that you can target people en masse in one place instead of searching for them in different places. And that's where the diversity of precedences would be a very encouraging kind of a thing to happen. And if that happens, people will not be picked up easily. Therefore, the color black in general is an obstacle to upward mobility or attempts to that. As in India, it happens that you belong to a particular caste or you belong to a particular kind of religion, and therefore that's a big obstacle to you in terms of your progress. So I think, Air Marshal, let me stop at this point, and then we will take up the other factors later. Okay, so thank you very much for the time. You are muted.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kalam. You've actually put the entire genesis of the caste and the racism in good perspective, and both in history, in terms of history as well as in terms of the practices. Let me invite Professor Manivannan, Ramu Manivannan. I would request, I would pose a couple of questions to him. And what is it that the state, the US went to a major bloodshed in 1860-64 time frame, and on the question of human dignity, equality, and abolition of slavery. But as Professor Kalam pointed out, it took them another 100 years to get the voting rights. I thought the entire Civil War is all about getting back, the fundamental issue of equality. And what is it that the state does or fails in implementing what it seeks to establish right in the beginning? And why do societies, resist that kind of a change? And what is it that actually happens in the US governance or US political system that prevents this issue of black animosity being removed from the society? Professor Manivannan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Air Marshal Matheswaran sir, and Professor Kalam, and others who have joined this meeting. And I'm more than happy in a sense is that, like, in India, in a country like India, we could come and share our reflections about what's happening in the United States, and without removing ourselves from the reality of what's been happening in India over the centuries as well. So this is the first connection that I find to this discussion.
Your video is off, Professor. Unless your bandwidth is a problem. No problem. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So the video has not come. You can hear me? Yeah.
Who is the speaker? I don't see.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we can see you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mentioned that, like, respected Air Marshal Matheswaran and other Professor Kalam. And I'm more than happy to be joining this discussion because of the context that, like, what is happening in the United States, and also looking at our own country over the centuries, and this is a very important reflection. And I did collect your questions, Air Marshal. And first, let me say about there's a very the first thing is about racism in the West, or racism in other parts of the world, is deep rooted, and it has never been driven out of the system. That's the body politic, like, speaking the language of politics. It has never been removed. It has never been kept out of the body politic of our political societies in the world. The first thing. And from a social and anthropological point of view that Professor Kalam presented, how we recognize and then distinguish, discriminate based on race, color, and various other identities. And in United States, I find the making of the first, speaking about United States, actually, we'll come back to India a little later, and the making of the new nation, what you call the new world, the United States itself, it's embedded in violence. It's embedded in physical violence. It's embedded in political violence and social violence and cultural violence. And so violence against humanity, the genocide. And the genocide, it's built upon, this is how the state has been built in United States. Then, like the Civil War, you have, on the one hand, you see a very passionate as well as a very compassionate outlook in the life of Abraham Lincoln, and then the post-Civil War year. And nothing has receded in terms of the social outlook. Then the Southern perspective, what is classically said in the United States politics is the North-South divide in terms of racial violence is highly distinct, even to this day. That is something we should bring this. Then in the 20th century also, you have the Chicago 1919 Chicago violence and the uprising, and the New York City Harlem neighborhood uprising and 1935. Then you have a Detroit in 1943, and Los Angeles is 1943, 65, and 92. Then the Americans also talk about the long, hot summer of 1967. And so these periods of violence, and then looking at the life of, I do not even see the coming of Reverend Martin Luther King. It's a remarkable period. It's a remarkable pace and remarkable period. And then how the native, what they call the Afro-Americans, consolidated themselves, the right to vote is so important to express ourselves, the right to vote. I mean, not to eliminate discrimination, not to eliminate the oppression, but to say that we exist. This is a very, very remarkable thing of the 1960s, the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is very, very important in this context about then to ask what the Civil Rights Act has done. The Civil Rights Act that Professor Kalam mentioned about, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then after this enactment of this act, how much it has been done in terms of the social discrimination, the ghettos that exist, then the gap between, it's not the gap that we talk in India in terms of the rich and the poor. That is a very, very, we say that's a very undermining word, the gap between the rich and the poor. The gap in terms of the quality of life itself. It's not about the rich and poor. The quality of life, the outlook to life, then the wealth discrimination. This is where there is a mentioning of the caste being a class in India. And then the caste and class is kind of we cannot separate. This is one of the reasons why the seemingly more radical, the left parties and the left movements and the parliamentary left parties have failed to build and consolidate people's movement in this country, because they never looked at the caste as a factor. This has been one of the historical flaws and historical mistakes in the part of the left movement in India. But in case of the United States, this question of the racial injustice and racial violence is existed perpetually. And a system, how the system perpetuated this violence is also very, very interesting. And in terms for example, about you make the law, but the enforcement of the law rests on the dominant people who are dominant in the system, the political system, the racial dominance, and then the cultural, the power structure. And so this is how, like, the death of George Floyd, and it's not the first incident. And this is not the first time this has happened since 1960s, actually. And after the Civil Rights Movement or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this has been continuously happening. This has been continuously happening in the police stations, as well as in the prisons, and then in the schools, in public places. So, like, this is where you find the similarity in India. This is where you find the similarity in India, is that in terms of the marginalized, the status of the marginalized people. And to say that, like, this has only a kind of a significance of the caste, as a rural factor, or like, but in overall, the approach to life, the opportunities to life. And when people talk about equality, and like, this equality cannot just be enunciated, cannot just be experienced by promulgating an ordinance, or making it as an executive act of the state, saying that, like, this is in practice. But what is more important is that to ensure that the opportunity reaches, is open. And like, the greatest denial in any political society is that the denial of an equal opportunity. The denial of an opportunity is so important. I find about in India, and it's so true in India as well. So true in India that, like, inequality is not just about, it's a practice, but denying an equal opportunity is been a practice as well. So, like, in that, the whole context of the Martin Luther King's life, and then the struggle, and then the right to vote, and now that has been a very, very remarkable movement. The very remarkable movement, and we need to see here there are important questions that they are rising in United States now. Is about, like, regulating the police powers, and like, how defunding. I'm not talking about defunding at this stage, because I don't think the government, or even the governors of the Minneapolis governor, or the presidential nominees from Democratic Party also agree on defunding. But certainly they raised a very interesting question about, like, what they call the regulation of the police powers. And like, in a country like India, we don't even talk about the colonial. We talk about anti-imperial. We talk about imperialism. We talk about colonialism, and we don't talk about the colonial laws in India. And then why we don't talk about it is, like, in India, even our own idea of freedom is also. I always tell my students, or in political discussion, that on the one hand we fought for freedom, but the power was transferred. It's a transfer of power. And in this transfer of power, the caste and class has been maintained as the status quo. The caste and class, and which is the same in India, like, has been maintained. The caste and class factor has been maintained, so that this has become a more as a transfer of power than the freedom or independence or a liberation of the masses. Then, like, you have to substantially look at the legal, and then legislation, and the power, how to cohabitate in a political system, or like, how to share this power. So with that kind of political education has not happened in the United States, has not happened in many societies, and has certainly not happened in India. Has certainly not happened in India. So that is why you have this kind of gap, like in the United States, when they're talking about, like, regulating the police powers, or like, how do we bring the police powers, or like, do we militarize them? It is not simply like, funding them, or reducing the funding, but like, keeping them in a kind of regulation and supervise. You are accountable. You are accountable for your actions. And then, like, the immunity to the state apparatus. immunity to the police. And like, in India also you have this immunity of like to state authorities. But beyond the immunity is also this immunization is not only for the state and the authorities in India. That immunization extends right down to the village and to the caste, the dominant power structures in the society. So like, we need to ask this very serious questions about like, what is meant by immunization in the United States when they're talking about regulating the police powers, and then about like, how to reduce this gap about the wealth and a social, it is not, I don't consider it as a social stigma for me to be in a car, to be in a color, and to be kind of like, to be told that you belong to this caste. But then like, it is, I should decide my caste. I should decide who I'm the one who should decide, not the other person, about my identity. And so that right people don't have. That's a very, very fun, you are talking about fundamental right actually. And so like, it is not, it is okay to be black, it is okay to be brown, it is okay to be white, and or to be like, it is okay to be non-white or to be a white, but then I should decide that. So that's the kind of empowerment, because it's all very, very genetic, it is a natural and organic process. So like, this is the like, this is like what happened to the American singer, the pop singer that like, who kind of like wanted to change his own complexion and ended up living very short period in his life, because all is a great musician, highly talented person. But a white musician never has to go through that kind of changing the appearance. But for a black musician, and exceptionally thing, he had to undergo that change and ended up with a very short life. So this kind of identity crisis also you are generating in other people's consciousness. So I wanted to raise all these questions, regulation of powers and then empowerment, and this violence is persisting. Violence is persisting, and it's a stream of perennial stream. And so that empowerment means here is that it is not only in legislation and enforcement, but it is also in the actual execution. And then this execution is not just a play of like, making laws, but like, creating this opportunity, democratizing the culture of it. It is not by saying we are all equal, but we have to democratize even that idea that we are equal. And like, we are creating like, some as more equal than the others. And then like, this first among the equals and more equal than the others. Then so we have to go further into, flow deep into the system and to question the laws, the system and the practice, like talking about regulation, like in India, talking about like, where the colonial laws are, why these colonial laws are existing, and why this imperial system is still existing. And then like, why people in the ruling classes and ruling authorities don't question the colonial laws. And then why they don't bring about these changes is not that they lack majority to pass a law. On the other hand, is that like, everything is given as a small bits and pieces, a concession to the masses and the downtrodden people. So like, rights are not a concession. Rights are absolute rightful claim. So this, unless we begin to think that opportunity is a very important criteria that must be just placed before us. And so George Floyd was not the first person, and nor like, I see this kind of to be the last situation. And I don't want more death, but certainly see this like that we need to have a very deep flowing into the system and questioning how the system works, how we kind of consciousness, social consciousness. And in the process, we have to also recognize the taking into the white community, also people with goodwill to come in and to contribute to this transformation. And I know that like, much more can happen through this discussion. And I have taken this time only to place these questions before you. And I want to kind of like, step back and listen to others. Thank you very much, Air Marshal Matheswaran.
Thank you, Professor. It's wonderfully covered. Before I get on with the subsequent part of the discussion, let me inform everybody, please raise your questions on the chat, or when we open out to the audience, there is a provision to raise your hand, and accordingly we will, in sequence, we'll raise the issue.
So I wish to ask Mr. Ramu.
Let me finish. I'll just after that I'll come back to you, Mr. Khalid.
Okay.
Now, Professor Ramu raised two very important issues. One is, of course, the nature of violence, which stems from a history and certain past, which I link it to the colonialism and the imperialism, history. And the second part is about implementation and execution. So let me raise two questions to both Professor Kalam and Professor Ramu. Is that one, the modern West, the international system dominated by the West flows from the kind of violent occupation of lands and domination of peoples over the last 400 years. So the US, the North America, is founded on probably the biggest human rights violations of elimination of the natives and, of course, import of slaves to actually run the economies, the massive, agricultural economy that was built by the slave labor imported from Africa. And all that violent practices to keep them subjugated is at the core of that entire process. Same thing in Mexico, Latin America, and South America, where the Spaniards slaughtered the indigenous civilization, the indigenous people, and subjugated everybody to put their system in place. And at the core of all this is the racist philosophy. If states have then come in and realized this subsequently, if the states don't implement rationalization of the administrative structure, judicial structure for implementation, then implementation suffers. So the question that I raise is, if equal opportunities are not given for education, if that disadvantaged community is not allowed to rise up, as Professor Kalam pointed out, then you find that the executive positions in the administration, in judiciary, in police gets dominated by the powerful community. In the US, it's the whites who dominate that, and therefore implementation becomes a problem. If you come to India, the same thing occurs. Despite very secular, very ideal constitutional provisions, if you take the judiciary today, it is dominated by the upper caste to the extent of 80%. So is the bureaucracy. So are the practices in the police and down to the village administration. You find children forced to wear different color, threads or ribbons in their hands in village schools and panchayat schools. So how do you actually remove all that if you don't bring in rationalization in political power and judicial and executive power in the administration? Yeah, Mr. Kalam.
It's for me?
Yeah, for you.
Yeah, I think I had actually noted down two things on my notepad here. One was about let me use the word persecution of the Native Americans, which happened in the United States. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, wherever they were oil-rich areas. And I think without any hesitation, the whites, when they came up, started slaughtering, as Air Marshal was pointing out, the people who are there. And they have been reduced to such a bad kind of a state today that they're almost become invisible, and they have been put up in reservations. And I don't want to go into the details in terms of what has happened to that life in a day-to-day manner, and how the alcoholism and the other drugs and other things have overtaken their life in such a bad way. Yeah, that's one of the things. But what happens today is that, given that the black issue in terms of the subjugation or oppression and segregation of the blacks is happening in such a big way, this has become a hidden kind of a thing. But anybody who wants to know the history of what has happened to the Native Americans, I think they should know this. And I think till about I may be a bit wrong about the date, till about 1917 or 1937, there was an act of Congress by which they were allowed to become a citizen. They were non-citizen nationals. Okay, now that was the kind of thing which had happened to them. And unfortunately, in India too, what happens is that the percentage of the percentage of the tribals in India is about half of what is there for the Dalits. So 8% tribals almost, or 8 to 9%, and we have almost double of that in terms of the Dalits. And therefore, some of the issues which are there. And like in the United States, for the tribals of India also, what has happened is they have been around places which are high in natural resources. And for the exploitation of those resources, as it happened in the US, here also, I think different kinds of mechanisms were adopted, both by the state as well as the private agencies, and they have been driven very badly. So these are the two things, I think, which Air Marshal was referring to. Now, the other point which I had made earlier was that irrespective of the kind of laws and regulations that you have on paper, implementation or how you go about it administratively in terms of implementing those things are something I think which become very important issues. And therefore, when we are talking about certain cosmetic changes or cosmetic dressing which happens in so many different places, we should also keep in mind the fact that at the ground level, irrespective of the legislation and the kind of regulations which we have brought in, very little changes happen. And not just India and the United States, there are many places where indigenous populations, for instance, the Aborigines of Australia, when the whites started coming in, the kind of atrocity that they mounted on the Aborigines is something I think mind-numbing, and is a very chilling kind of a thing. And anybody who reads the history of the Aborigines, along with the history of the Native Americans or that of the tribals in India, would be touched by the kind of things which have done. Now, this is because of the kind of power which the state has got. And this unilateral power of use of power by the state towards its own people, in quotes, own people, which sometimes is not considered by the state as something important, is something which is very disturbing. And lots of work has been done in India, United States, as well as in Australia and other places. The New Zealanders have combated it in a slightly better way, but some of the practices were bad because the New Zealanders had this group called the Maori, who are the tribal. Yeah. So this kind of will happen everywhere, but I think we have a long way to go in spite of the fact that we are in the 21st century. We have rules and regulations and laws on paper, but then what's happening at the ground level is something I think which we need to look at. And therefore, what happens is anybody who is deprived of something, and in 99% of the cases when we are talking about deprivation, the deprivation first comes from economy. Economic deprivation takes care of so many different things. I mean, adds to so many different problems which are there. And once you are economically deprived, you are vulnerable. And once you're vulnerable, different kinds of things happen to you, including the COVID-19, for instance. Who is it affecting the most today? In the United States, is the Black population disproportionate to that population in the overall population of the United States that are getting affected. Sometimes in some places, about 70 to 80% of them in a given area. Therefore, this vulnerability comes in. So the basic thing is that if you're denied economic power, economic upward mobility, different kinds of problems happen to you. And in India also, we have been seeing this kind of a thing. And therefore, to demonstrate the economic power in a different kind of way, you go to any village or township, when somebody makes money, when there's upward economic mobility, the first thing those people start aspiring for is political power. How to translate your economic power into a political power is something which everybody tries when they come in. For instance, a village headman who has made a lot of money, somewhere legally or illegally, wants to be the village panchayat chairperson. So this combination of economic power, which gets translated most often into political power, is a dangerous mix. And in India, unfortunately, what happens is certain sections are kept completely out of either the economic power or the political power, because of the fact that as a concomitant mobility of social status does not happen. So let me rest my case at that point, and then we will take up certain issues again later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Ramu, would you like to say something?
Yes, I would like to respond to the questions or the issues that Air Marshal Matheswaran placed. First about like the legislation, the laws and the enforcement and the state project. I mean, I put this word as a state project is like the establishment or the making of the state itself, then where Professor Kalam talked about the violence. And so the violence is very, very embedded, deeply embedded in this state project of whether it's the United.
Yeah, your voice seems to have got cut. Can you all hear? Can you hear?
No, sir, I think we've lost him. One second.
Professor Ramu, can you hear us? Professor Kalam, can you hear us? Yeah, okay. I think we've lost him. Okay, let's.
I can hear you. I had muted. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. I think Ramu, we have lost him. Yeah.
Lost him. Okay, no problem. So we'll take the questions from the audience. Yeah, Khalil Gibran, we can go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Actually, I wish to ask Mr. Dr. Ramu, so he's not here, right?
Okay, then would you like to wait till the joins us?
No, I can ask Kalam, Mr. Kalam.
Yeah, okay. Ask.
So can you compare the protest and response from the government between the India and USA? In the last days, we see that.
I'm sorry. Can you go slow and clearly? I'm not able to catch what you're saying.
Okay. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wish to from you on. I like to hear from you that the protest and response from the government in both countries, between India and USA. In the last videos, we see that aftermath of unfortunate incident in USA, that went the protest that went around the USA, but this many protests before on several topics or several issues happened in India also. So the responses from the same from these two governments is very different. Being the largest democratic country, India, how India see the democratic protest, and how the U.S. government see the protest like democratic protest like this. So my question is focused on the protest and the responses from the government.
Yeah, Professor.
I think there are different ways in which the state responds. And sometimes in certain places, you are also seeing the state response as state terrorism, for instance. Okay, so it's very difficult to generalize as to how these things happen, but different states have different ways of doing it. For instance, this particular case of George Floyd, people talk about how the policeman had kept his knee on the neck of this person for about 9 minutes and killed him. One of the factors which people are not talking about is this person was hapless. He was handcuffed. Okay, now that is something. How the policemen are trained to combat a particular kind of a situation. There was no riot here. There was no violence here. Okay, there was nothing happening. This person was arrested. He was handcuffed behind his hands. And then this person puts him down on the ground. And therefore, and in India also, this kind of high-handedness comes in. Now, you may say that I'm talking about the police response, but then in democracy, how the police response or how law and order mechanism responds is the responsibility of the state. And in India, they are no better. You know how the minorities, the Dalits and the tribals are treated by the state through its machinery of the police. Okay, and in different places, the riot police or who are geared to doing certain things are protected in different ways. They have different kinds of shields, and at the law and order point, they react differently. That's in terms of ground level reality, in terms of how the state's machinery responds. Now, how the politicians respond, the ministers going right up to the top, how they respond to something also depends on the kind of society we have. For instance, in India, if it is something which is done by an upper caste person, the response of the state is different. And if it is done by somebody who belongs to a minority or a tribal or a Dalit, the response of the state is different. Similarly, in the United States, the president of the United States, Mr. Trump, went to the extent of saying that go and shoot, almost. Okay, now if this kind of license is given, whereby you say that anything is possible, so the state does not respond, to put it very bluntly, the state does not respond in a democratic system also equally to all groups of people. Depends on the group of people or the kind of category which the state is dealing with in terms of how they deal with it. There's no uniformity in terms of how people are dealt with, and the state has a uniform policy. Nowhere, even in democracies, the state has got a uniform policy of dealing with the deprived people or the upper caste people or the people who come from an upper bracket like the upper classes. They are dealt with differently. For instance, the Jewish lobby in the United States always can dictate certain things which happen. In India, certain businessmen can dictate certain things to the state. Okay, therefore, we don't have to go beyond this. And you know what I'm talking about, that the state does not have a uniform way of dealing with all sections of the population.
Okay, who's the next person? Any questions?
So,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Punjika.
okay, I have a couple of questions. The first one is if the panelists could speak to us a little more about colorism in South Asia itself and how much of a black and white culture, so to say, we have embedded in our society, and how that is also so intrinsically related to caste in India. That's one. And the other one is Professor Kalam, of what you were saying on how the state reacts differently to different sections of the society. This is about violence and how it is conceptualized differently. So I remember reading something really powerful by Malcolm X and watching an interview where he was a part of it. And he said that Black people are the only people who are asked to be non-violent. So, you know, there's only, it's really different when the state does it for safety, but when the minorities do it, like that's been one of the biggest criticisms of this protest and has also led to a lot of people invalidating the movement itself, even though it's a really important period in civil rights history currently. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And let me start off. You may not be using it, people using Fair and Lovely. That answers your question partly. Okay. The whole system in India, for instance, is based on color. Varna means color. And if you go through what Varna exactly is in terms of the different color gradations, you find that it's based on that. And therefore, whether you are looking at poetry in India from different languages, or if you're looking at movies, the kind of depiction, stereotyping of the blacks, Kali Kaloti, for instance, is a standard kind of a thing which happened. And Gaon Ki Gori, okay, is the other thing which is there. Therefore, India is not bereft of colorism or the color factor which is there, because the Varna system itself is embedded in color. And therefore, the kind of things which happen in India, for instance, if you look at it, the complexion of the people, for instance, decides as to how capable or how good they are most of the time. And in the South, for instance, one of the members of the ruling party, for instance, made a statement that though people from the South are black, we still consider them as our own people. All right, now this has happened at the highest kind of level. There has hardly been any kind of a condemnation of that person's statement of that kind. Therefore, color operates in a very, very big way. And the fact that Fair and Lovely cream sells crores of rupees of cream itself, where a person like Shah Rukh Khan also wants to come in from the male point of view and advertise for something counter to, not counter, complementary to men getting things. And then say, for instance, a statement like, this can happen in different contexts, a statement like, she's dark but beautiful. Okay. Now, this means that all dark are bad, one of the dark is beautiful. Or say, for instance, though that person belongs to the minority or the person belongs to a Dalit community, that person is good. Now, this is not a compliment. This is like castigating the entire community by saying that all of them are bad, one of them turns out to be good. For instance, Nandita Das is one of the most beautiful women I think we have got in the country. All right. And people will always refer to her complexion first and then say that in spite of being dark, she's good looking. Okay. Now, that's not a positive kind of a compliment to you. You just say the person is good. That's a different kind of a thing which happened. Now, that's one. The other thing, of course, what you were saying was in terms of the state response to how the state responds to different sections of the society. It's quite obvious the state does not have a uniform policy of response. The state responds differently depending on who the person is. For instance, the blacks in the United States, okay, they get a response which is completely different. And having taught in some universities at the highest level in the US, for instance, I have been observing that, as well as the long experience that you have had in the country, in India. For instance, state response to most of the things which happen depends on who the person or the group is. All right, and then they will see as to whether there's a valid kind of a response or not. And this is, of course, highly discriminatory, but nevertheless, it happens.
Yeah. So in that same context, why doesn't the state, for example, you mentioned about Fair and Lovely, as an example, should the state actually get involved in banning such kind of promotions and advertisements if it truly believes on an egalitarian society?
Yeah, I think the state has also other things to do. But in this case, what happens is that people's education, in quotes, education, not literacy, I think should be one of the important factors here, because there are areas where state cannot exactly go in. For instance, the other thing which is most disturbing is that in a bottle of a cola, okay, average bottle of cola, there are 12 spoons of sugar. All right. Now, most of the cities in India are becoming diabetes capitals. So the state is not responding to that in any way. One campus where I lived, for instance, for 4 years in Assam, I was holding a chair in the sociology social work department at Tezpur University. On the campus, the university had banned any colas or any sodas to come in. All right. Now, the state, if it wants, can do that or have high taxes for that, or educate the people as to how dangerous these things are. And of course, if it is possible, this kind of discrimination which is there, but the whole state machinery itself is based on color. And therefore, the state would not be, I think, very happy to take up a kind of a question which sometimes may go against its own activity which is doing it. Because if you look at it, the way the state is organized, and the people who are supporting the state make statements like the dark people are also Indians and we tolerate them and we have them. The state, I think, does not think that it's necessary, and it has never done that. It has never taken anything from the point of view of people, but that's one. The second thing is, even if it has got a kind of a legislation or bans in courts, something of that kind, what happens at the ground level? For instance, the tobacco and certain chewing things have been banned. But then, there's a huge scandal in Tamil Nadu in terms of how people have made money from bans. And sometimes bans are brought in by the state so that certain groups of people can make money. For instance, prohibition, when it is there, we know that prohibition has failed in many places all through, including the United States, when during the 1930s they had a prohibition. But prohibition enables people to make money too. So bans can sometimes be counterproductive, where people can get some kind of an economic gain out of the bans. But your question is very well taken, that can the state do something about it? Yeah, if there are people, educating the people would be more, I think, important than banning certain things. That's where the question of text and context comes in.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Next one. Benelin, you can come out with your, you can ask the question. Yeah, come.
I think, has Manivannan joined us? Yeah, I think he has joined us.
Okay. Professor Rama, you can go ahead. Yeah, that's right. You can complete what you were saying. That's right. You need to unmute. Yeah, okay. Oh, sorry.
No, your mic is muted, Manivandan.
Okay, now it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. See, I would like to add that, like, the power, the concept, the whole idea of power and the retention of power, and where the state building as a project. I say this, I repeat the statement: state building as a project is that the whole question of, like, even this whole idea of when the United States was fighting in Iraq, the question was raised in the Congress in United States that, like, they kept talking about, like, the leadership, the president, and every other member of the cabinet was asking that, we must continue to fight. Then one of the members raised a question that how many of you and your families have family members fighting in the battle in Iraq? This was a very, very important question, actually, like, not only in case of, like, how we define the idea of the state, the power, the patriotism, then the wars. And so there is a very deep rooted, there's a polarization. And then where even about education there is, we don't even have education. There's a deep segregation. It's about, like, anti-segregation laws in the United States in the 1960s. And then as a result of the civil rights movement, if you take a country like India, when we are talking about education itself, like, there are so many different layers of education that the public schools, like what you called as the convents, and then about, like, where there's a stream for middle classes, where there's a stream for upper classes, then the syllabus. But you can say that, like, India is a very big country, and we can't have a uniform education. I agree, and I respect the diversity. But at the same time, if you're going to divide education based on, like, what you called as, like, economic and social divisions, that's where my question is. And the social polarization and the economic polarization are the factors in about our education system. So that is where I find about, like, this deep rooted, like you raised a question about social and caste consciousness in India, in the rural areas, when children wear different colors of bands in their hand, and then the t-shirts in the schools, and the young people wear the t-shirt. I also would like to say there is another dimension to that, is the social and economic competition and rivalry. I would rather put it as a social and an economic rivalry. And then, like, this has been a very big factor in the riots in India. Riots happen in India not only because of the social, economic, or social, ethnic, and religious reasons, but also due to the economic competition, economic rivalry, or, like, deep-rooted economic social animosities. And so when you place these questions in the West as a state building, and, like, somebody like Trump can say anything he wants as a president of the country, but he has been saying, if you look at his life track of a statement that he has been so consistent. He's been so consistent. He has created a kind of a block and for himself, that this particular block would just carry him, has been carrying him, that he has been able to divide the society very, very successfully in the last 4 years, or in the previous, say, in the last 7 or 8 years. He has created a constituency for himself. And my fear about this, all the recent developments, is that, like, although the media has been stating that, like, his appeal or is standing among the United States masses of people is declining, what in United States famously people call as the approval rate is showing decline. On the other hand, that he is also consolidating his constituency on the other hand. So, like, that reveals the divide in the political society. And then that also reveals about, like, why these reforms are not actually going through into the implementation. and why the courtrooms, the judiciary, the police as institution, why the bureaucracy, and why our school, including the United States school education system, is still the same as what it has been. So that is what I want to mention in this state project.
I have got a question from Benolin Kannadasan here. Okay, and the question is, it's famously said that politics is downstream of society and culture. You also mentioned the need for contextual change instead of mere legislation. So how do you see the prospects of social movement in today's polarized world? I think instead of talking about the world, Benolin, we will have to talk about different contexts in which if there is a possibility of a social movement to come in. In India, one of the difficulties of social movement to come in is the fact that what happens is the kind of polarization which is already there in the society, the way it is divided. Class solidarity is something which is important for people to come in. By class solidarity, I mean cutting across different social groups, or in India, different caste groups. Now, that's something which does not happen so easily in India, and therefore, when you do not have solidarity of the class kind horizontally, okay, vertical solidarity in any case will not happen in India between the different castes. It does not happen so easily. So when we do not have lateral or horizontal solidarity, a social movement to come about is difficult. For instance, if you take up a factory situation or an industry situation, the industrial labor may come from different backgrounds. But because there is something for them in common, sometimes they form a solidarity group. And the solidarity group cuts across the individual backgrounds of those people, and therefore some kind of a movement can take place in that kind of a situation. But in a polarized society otherwise, okay, where there are so many differences in terms of ethnicity, language, culture, regional background of the people, religious background of the people, coming across to form a social movement would mean that you need that kind of a solidarity to happen and a kind of a common platform on which people can come. That doesn't happen so easily. But one of the things which is positive in India, which has happened, is that Ambedkar strived for it for a very, very long time. But during his lifetime, it did not happen so easily. And therefore, in 1956, just before he died, he converted to Buddhism and thought that he could bring people together on a common kind of a platform from the kinds of inside or inherent divisions which were there. And much later, from the early 1970 onwards, when the Dalit Panther movement started in Maharashtra, some kind of a solidarity emerged and is emerging among the different Dalit groups, which is happening because of the fact that they have got a common enemy, they have a common oppressor, that is caste Hinduism, and some kind of a thing is happening amongst them. But otherwise, there are very few examples in India of this kind of a social movement to happen. But it's a very positive thing that whatever Ambedkar strived for during his life and which did not happen during his lifetime is happening because they have got something in common to come together. The different Dalit groups in different parts of the country have formed some kind of a group. And if you look at from the point of, from the point when Ambedkar died in 1956 till about the middle of the 1970s, his work was hardly read by anybody. And because of this Maharashtra example where the Dalit Panther movement started and Dalit itself became an important kind of a group, a group in order to fight oppression, the works of Ambedkar have been published by the Maharashtra government and others quite a lot, and some kind of a solidarity is emerging. And therefore, certain positive things which have happened to Dalits in the last 15, 20 years, 25 years, but they had to go in for different kinds of movements. For instance, protest movements of different kinds, like converting to another religion. All of you, I think, are familiar in Tamil Nadu about the Meenakshipuram mass conversion, which took place in February 1981. Now, these kind of things had to happen, and solidarity was required. Therefore, to answer your question very briefly, though I have taken a long time, is to say that social movements can happen when there is solidarity which comes up between different groups of people and they come on a common platform. So that's a basic requirement which is there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Kalam. And yeah, please go ahead, Sunil Kumar. Yeah, Sunil. Unmute yourself.
Thanks, sir. Yeah, thanks, sir. Good morning, team. Thanks for a good clarification on the genesis of all this racism, which is happening in the US as well as in India. We understood, you have mentioned about the civil rights movement as well as civil rights act in US. But even after this implementation of this act also, still US is facing all these issues very often. So my question here is there any hope that this racism completely gets curbed off from the US? If answer is yes, what type of approaches US or world need to be approached and implemented? And if no, answer is no, then what can be the long run result?
If the question is if there is going to be an elimination of racism,
Correct.
then the answer, of course, simple is no. As long as people are divided into black and white, okay, racism will continue. The only thing is, in different pockets in the United States as well as in other places, people have learned to tolerate, coexist, and curb certain activities that they have towards the other. Okay, if that happens, you can improve the relations. You cannot eliminate racism altogether, but in different ways, in different contexts and different kinds of places, in different situations, thing may come up whereby it will be a range of different kinds of things. For instance, in some places, most of the people may in fact see to it that subjugation has gone on for a very long time and that has to be curbed, and therefore they may come together and allow people to say take up a house. How many people in Tamil Nadu will allow a Dalit to come and stay in Agraharam in spite of the fact that the upper caste may not be there today in Agraharam? Now the similar kind of a thing has to happen. Okay, and therefore this caste, class and power aspect which is there in India is caste, in other places the class thing plus the race thing which is there, therefore it will happen. And therefore to say that in India we will get rid of discrimination against the lower castes or the minorities, that's not going to happen. In the US, to say that racism will be eliminated, that's not going to happen. People should learn to reduce what is happening and try to see how best they can coexist, because the entire progress of the country depends on how people coexist at different levels. And our politicians, when they divide people, they don't realize the fact that Dalits and minorities participating in the larger economy of the country is beneficial to the country. They look at the small term kind of a gains whereby in a riot, you try to bring down and raise to the ground the economy of either the Dalits or the Muslims or the minorities. But you don't realize the fact that you are cutting the tree or the branch on which you are sitting, and the branch or the tree happens to be the nation. Okay, unless that's realized, I think coexistence and tolerance will not happen. And unless coexistence and tolerance can come about, you cannot eliminate the discrimination against different groups which is there, or even to reduce the discrimination which is there between different groups. Thank you.
That's true. Yeah, somebody else? Anybody else? Yeah, Professor Ramu, you want to say something?
Yeah, can I add a point to what Professor Kalam mentioned about, like, or to the question by Dr. Sunil, who mentioned about, like, you know, whether I do agree with the view that, like, you know, we cannot bring an end to this right away, bringing an end to racism or like, but I definitely see the need to bring an end. I definitely see it, because that's what is the politics, a political or a social movement, or like what civil rights movement has done to the United States. The civil rights movement in the United States has done what Abraham Lincoln was even had even dreamt 100 years ago, prior to civil rights movement. So, like, you know, social movements do make a difference. Social movements do make a difference, and sustained political resistance does make a difference. And like in India, the entire the demography of politics has changed with the view of consciousness of the Dalit rights, and so these are all very important, actually. So I would say that, like, we may not see the end of racism. We may not see the end of, like, the caste and social and political violence against the marginalized people in this country. But we definitely have to see the path to end this violence. So that is where the human struggle is all about. That is where I would like to see the need of people like Martin Luther King, and see the need of people like Dr. Ambedkar. And then, like, so this is a sustained, prolonged struggle. And I see both the tunnel, I see the path, as well as the long path, as well as the need to see the hope through the struggle.
Thank you, Professor Ramu. I'd like to flag an important issue. One of the fundamental reasons why an incident like, or a major issue like George Floyd's happens, is that the state and the organs of the state arrange themselves with exceptional power concentrated in the dominant community or dominant power structures. And that is a deliberate design. And therefore, police brutality is one of the outcomes. It happens in India, and particularly in societies which are very, very, I would say underdeveloped and conservative, like in Eastern UP, in Madhya Pradesh, the kind of dacoity problems we had in Chambal, etc., the manifestation of an entire structure. Fundamentally, it was a caste problem between the lower caste and the Thakurs that led to the dacoity problem in Chambal. And so when we look at all this, as Professor Kalam pointed out, economic development is a vital necessity, and educational opportunities and educational development is a vital necessity. And then, of course, we need to recognize that currently, because of these differences, the dominant positions in the meritocracy gets dominated by the communities that have already exercised or enjoyed the fruits of that kind of an advantage earlier. And the state has to again exercise tremendous judgment to be able to provide adequate opportunities for the disadvantaged communities to become part of the executive organizational systems. So what I mean here is that if you take the educational institutions, it gets dominated by the privileged few, privileged communities. And similarly, if you take the leading institutions in India like IITs and IIMs, it's dominated by the upper caste. Does that mean there are no people with adequate merit who can actually measure up to it? I think the accusation is actually the other way, that those people are never allowed to come up even if they show adequate potential. And some of them move across abroad, and then they work and they find their outlet there as well. I did see a few figures in the US of Indian origin. One is, of course, the person called Tenmuri Soundararajan, who's from a Dalit community, who runs an organization called Equal Societies. And her statement is very, very, important. The current problem, George Floyd problem, etc., she relates to the failure of the white supremacy to believe that the rest of the world or the world itself matters to them. And I think any dominant community, I think it applies to everybody else as well. The second part is, as we move along, the state empowers the dominant community to exercise instruments of surveillance and today's technology will enable them even more, to ensure that the oppressed communities remain where they are and they don't challenge the existing power structure and hierarchy.
I think you have raised a very important issue, Air Marshal. The first thing about the killing of George Floyd, for instance, I think the question has to do with diversity. We are not bringing in enough diversity in everything. Say, for instance, a simple thing. There were 4 policemen, all the 4 were white. Okay. Now, if they had the 2 policemen go in each police car there. Suppose you have a white and a black, which would have meant 2 whites and 2 blacks. And in that case, I think the case, I'm not saying that George Floyd would have lived today. That's a different question. There will be some kind of a restraint when you know that there are people from a diverse kind of a background given in a particular kind of a situation where high-handedness would be reduced. For instance, the example that you are giving for the Uttar Pradesh thing, there was what was known as the PSC, Provisional Armed Constabulary in the US, which I mean in Uttar Pradesh, okay, where it was exclusively
manned,
dominant kind of groups of people. Okay, in this kind of a situation, if you have people with a diverse kind of a background, say for instance, enough minority people, enough Dalits, and then the middle class and the middle caste which are there, the chances of doing damage would be less. But that's not happening, and that's what I think is happening even in the US also. And during the Congress regime, during 2008, in the light of the Sachar committee report, the government of India had set up what is known as a diversity index group. I was part of that at the PMO level and also the Ministry of Minority Affairs level. Myself, Amitabh Kundu, Sugata Marjit, some of us professors, 5 of us were involved to develop a kind of a diversity index. The idea was that we have been meeting reservation categories, but we are not showing enough diversity. Therefore, you can say that, okay, I'm taking up the reservation issue and enough number of people are being recruited, but those group of people are not diverse to come from different kinds of backgrounds. That is not happening. And that's one of the, I think, most important requirements, whether we are talking about the US or we are talking about India. For instance, the positive discrimination or equal minority rights, which are there in the US, most of the time, those are flouted. And they find out ways of not filling up people from different classes and different in the US and different categories and different castes in India by sometimes keeping the posts open. And sometimes earlier there was this mechanism in India where you advertise thrice, don't fill up, and therefore you can make the position open. Now, there are ways in which this is flouted. I think it's a very important question that you have raised, that if you have people from different kinds of backgrounds in a given kind of a context, the chances that discrimination happens would be lower. For instance, if there is a selection board, let's take up, for instance, for the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, and if it is represented by different groups of people, you will have very little chance or less chance of filling up people from only one caste group or people from only one kind of background. Therefore, I think it's an important question that you have raised. Thanks for that. Thank you.
Professor Ramu?
Yes. I think about like in the reservation question, and like in the United States, the positive discrimination is that it prevails up. It relates to the native and indigenous population, then the other ethnic minorities and other questions. But my other concern is that how they enforce it. Like, for example, that there's no distributional justice in the system, in the whether it is in the United States system or like in the system in India, is that when I say distributional, it is not economic term only I'm using. I'm referred to this both in terms of like, even in terms of social inclusiveness, or like, economic distribution, or like regional justice in this country. So like, we are a democracy without justice. We deeply lack this. We all take pride in democracy as an end product. Democracy is not an end product. A democracy is a product in making. And it's an eternally we make this project. We make this product into a democratization. It's a continuous process. On the other hand, like, what we have built a system as like, as though it would remain forever as a permanent one. And we keep consolidating something transitory to a permanent structure, while the transitory values in a society, enforced values, have to change. That is not changing. And so this is a very huge contradiction in this whole democracy as the model of working system as well. Then I still want to go back to this question. If you ever want to say that, like, you want to open the windows of democratization, or like justice, as the seeds of justice, is that you have to create the opportunities of equal opportunity, and then creating up, like, in hundreds of cases, whether it would be it in employment, on education, or on health aspects, and or basic PDS system, public distribution system. It all pertains to what you call, like, you tell me the person, I will tell you the law. So, like, this is where I find about, like, our equal opportunity itself is not in the place in this country, and whether it is in United States or in our country. And for me, the democracy is still is a continuous process, actually.
Thank you. I think it's a very, very important observation. We have time for one last question. Anyone? Anybody who wants to raise a question? The audience? Okay, I just have one observation, and again I would ask the panelists to respond to that. One is, wherever I travel, I do. Sunod, you want to ask any questions? Fine.
Yeah, just unmuted. Just to add a point to what Professor Kalam and Professor Manivannan had mentioned in terms of bringing diversity. And Professor Kalam illustrated a very interesting, positioning of the incident that took place in US, and that 4 of the policemen were white. Right? What if there were a person from the minority community in that amongst the 4 constables? Perhaps there would have been a restraint. And I'll just add from my experience and exposure, this in a different construct, this was operationalized. And there was a major problem in areas of armed conflict and in terms of peace building. That was sexual violence. And this was happening quite rampantly. It was not on the basis of race, but this was a problem that was happening in different parts of the world. And the initial approach to sexual violence as a problem was seen as a problem which is faced by the female community. But then, as more study went into it, people got to realize that a gender-neutral approach has to be taken, because a large section of male community were also sexually victimized during armed conflict and post-armed conflict. And as a result of it, we started gradually seeing women into the armed forces in various sections, not in all sections, but in, like, for instance, an Air Force, in certain occupations, not necessarily in the army. And a lot in terms of the UN peacekeeping troops, women started showing up in constabulary functions. And this had a direct impact on the occurrence of sexual violence in post-conflict, in peace-building zones. But having said that, we also need to, the positive impact was certainly seen, but having said that, we also need to keep in mind that in a particular situation, it may not be always possible in terms of numbers to have every minority into that occupation, right? You may be able to have 1 out of 4, but sometimes you may not be even able to have 1 out of 4 in that group. Right? Now, it may, so in the case of the peacekeeping troops, it was a short-term benefit, it was seen. But in the long term, again, the fundamental problem solution that you suggested is what is the ideal thing, that is tolerance, education, quote unquote, away from literacy, illiteracy, focus on education and the tolerance. That's where I saw that solution. And these measures were, of course, welcome measures, but those are more short-term measures. That's what I could understand.
Thank you, Sunod.
Okay. Thank you, Sunod. And the points are very well taken. And while it may not be possible to have all the minority groups or different groups included somewhere, we should strive to have more diversity. The idea is to move towards more diversity rather than have a homogeneity or uniformity coming from only one kind of a group. It's not too difficult to do that. And, you know, the way we are moving, today it may be difficult, but it should not be too difficult to bring in more diversity.
Okay, so we are coming to the end of the panel discussion, and let me raise one last point, and that has to do with the concept of dignity of labor. So in this racism, caste consciousness, class consciousness, etc., the way one looks at, you know, people move with different levels, and they look at, you know, labor with different perspectives. The basic concept of dignity of labor is that you must respect any work done by any individual as something that he should do to the best of his ability, and his work should be respected and dignified. So one of the instances that I would quote is, I do, wherever I travel, I do engage the taxi drivers to get and pick up some information. And this person was driving me from Washington to Maryland. I was going for a track to, attending a track to dialogue. And the driver was a black. And so we set up a conversation on what's happening on the economy, etc. But what he brought out finally was very interesting. He turned out to be a postgraduate from Maryland University in international relations. And I said, what are you doing taxi driving? Why don't you go and teach in the university? He said, that's the difference. When the economy goes down, the white supremacy concept has made people that they will not go down to take up jobs which they think is below their dignity. But as I'm comfortable sleeping on the road. I'm comfortable driving a taxi. I also run an import-export business. And he said he's been to Bangalore, and he does that with IT logistics. And this is one of the important concepts. So colonial mindset and imperialism has also contributed to this. If you remember, much of the menial jobs were now reserved for Indians who were migrating to UK, London, post-independence. And that was one of the initial lot who were actually, encouraged. And this creates another problem. So when a community is now ostracized, or when a community is differentiated, then certain kinds of jobs are reserved for them and forced down upon them. The flip side of that is in the Indian caste system, and this is one of the professors raised that question. You can read scriptures, you can be the upper caste, but if the lower caste guy doesn't do his job and goes on a strike, the entire village, entire panchayats, entire urban center will come to a grinding halt. And none of your scriptures and none of your upper caste system is going to save the day, because the place will stink and nothing will work and nothing will move. I think this is a kind of an understanding that needs to come out quite rationally to be able to address the points that Professor Kalam and Professor Ramu raised in terms of bringing in diversity and opportunities for the people. Any points from your side as a closing comments on any of these issues? Professor Kalam?
Yeah, I think Sunod wants to say something. You want to?
No, not exactly, but in a very just to use some food for thought, and of course it's nearing lunch. In Pakistan, this was a development that took place about 2 months ago. An advertisement for carrying out the sewage work was a circular was issued. And for long in Pakistan, that work has been carried out only by the Christian community. And the circular specifically mentioned that this set of positions are reserved for the Christian community. But due to the COVID season, since we are finding shortage of people to work, we are opening up this position for our non-Christian communities. So without going too much into the details, but so the concept of dignity of labor is deeply attached into what amount of dignity that the community or the society attributes in a given geographical context. It may be a religious minority. In the case of India, it is not a religious minority. It is a different set of minority. So it is varying from place to place. I think we need to pay a lot of focus on the dignity of labor part. Yeah, that's what I wanted to.
I think, Air Marshal, you touched on a good point. Just as a closing kind of a thing, I would say that in the case of the upper caste, if they don't perform the duty, perform in courts, you get paid for most of the things that you do, for instance. And then as a priest or something, you don't do something, you are fine, all right, or somebody else may do it or not do it, but doesn't matter. God doesn't mind that. But the people from the lower caste don't have that kind of a liberty not to perform. They'll be forced to do it, and that's why the kind of lynching which happens and the kind of thing. Say, for instance, in Gujarat, some people said that we don't want to skin the cattle. Okay, you can't do that because the whole question of leather may be controlled by somebody who comes from a different kind of a caste, but then the performance of skinning the cattle, dead cattle, will be reserved for somebody. Therefore, they don't have the liberty or the luxury of saying that we can't do this. The liberty of saying we can't do this, we don't want to do this, is again reserved for the upper caste. So the other people from a lower position, they don't have that kind of a thing. And when they don't perform, they're made to perform in different ways. Physical violence will take in, their women will be abused, and sexual kind of a thing will happen. And you just have a wash, and then you wash away your sins if you are upper caste. But then the luxury of washing away your sins does not happen in the case of people who come from the lower caste. Therefore, this is something which will continue to be happening in India. But there are fights which are happening, and I'm happy that Dalit groups have been fighting quite a few of these things. But what happens is sometimes this comes up at a different kind of a level. At the level of a rural area, a group of people living in a village, maybe they do not have some kind of a clout whereby they can refuse to do certain things. The problem is the violence which comes in, their livelihood which depends on some of the people. And once the livelihood is cut in, some of the people, can you please mute your mics? The disturbance is coming in because the mics are open. Yeah. So this is the problem which happens, that at the risk of your life, at the risk of your livelihood. And sometimes people may fight for that, like the migrant labor are doing. But livelihood of the people attached to you in the family becomes very important. You are not fighting only for yourself as a single, isolated, one single person or something. You are fighting on behalf of your children. You are fighting on behalf of the women in the family, and you are fighting for your extended family. Sometimes it may go up to the community. And that's where the rub comes in. You don't have the liberty to refuse to do certain things. Thank you.
Absolutely. Professor Ramamanivannan, your closing remarks? Yeah. I'll just unmute you.
Unmute your mic, Manivannan.
Yeah, unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah, done. So I would like to, we are at the tail end of a discussion. There is a kind of a self-dignity to labor, but there is no dignity of labor in this country. There is, I mean, I'd like to place this contradiction about, there is a human dignity. People feel that they are forced to do, they are conditioned to do by various social practices and cultural kind of enforcements, like the example from Pakistan. Then we have in India also, then like, the sewage, and then about like, the open latrines, and so many other spaces, public spaces. But I would like to record one aspect is that there should be and will be political resistances, and then the social movements in this direction that will go on, and we don't know when and how soon, but definitely that kind of change we want to see. But I want to come back to another end. As a closing note from my side, I want to make this observation. We do not want to forget, as a social memory and also as a collective consciousness, how the Indian government and Indian state has treated the migrant labor during the COVID-19. This is a very, very important aspect about how they were forced to march from north to south and from south to north, and then how without any kind of empathy, humanity, And so this is where the power and the power of the state and the power structure views, attributes the level of dignity that they attribute to the labor in this country. And I definitely want this society to preserve this as a collective and a social memory about the treatment that was meted to the migrant labor. And then we keep meting out the kind of poor dignity show demonstrated by historically and currently as well towards the people who do the most humbling of professions to sustain the life of human societies. I mean, this is something that we need to keep this in our consciousness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So we come to the end of the day's discussion, and let me conclude by saying the George Floyd case is a wake-up call for the whole world and all societies, because of the social malady, whether it's racism, caste problems, or the apartheid practice, or class divisions, is all a manifestation of a huge human society problem. And with populations touching nearly 8 billion in crowded societies, I think this is something that needs to be addressed. It also relates to economic and political power and education. It remains now for me to thank our expert panelists, Professor Kalam and Professor Ramu Manivannan. Thank you so much for your valuable inputs. It's been an excellent discussion, and we've enjoyed the whole process. And on behalf of everybody and the Peninsula Foundation, I thank you both.